Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Introduction to PHP course. Today's lesson is going to be a rather fun lesson because we're going to be learning about how to use PHP's built-in mail function, which is going to allow us to send emails from our PHP scripts. Specifically, we're going to talk about a little bit about the built-in extension, and then we're going to go over some basics of SMTP, which stands for Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. And what that is that's how email messages get transferred from a sender and a recipient on the internet. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, and we're going to talk about how it works in both Windows and in a Linux or Unix operating environment. We're going to talk about some mail configuration directives that are within php.ini. We're going to go over a little bit about mail server authentication, and then talk about a program provided by XAMPP called Fake Send Mail for Windows, which basically allows you to send email from your PHP programs with a little more flexibility than comes built into just PHP by itself. And specifically, we're going to talk about sort of the function that does it all, which is the mail function, which is the built-in function of PHP that allows you to send email. And then we're going to update our web application to include a Contact Us page that's going to allow a customer to email the store administrator. So as mentioned, PHP provides a built-in mail extension, and what it does is it provides two functions, but the main function that's used is this function here, mail. And what that allows you to do is basically send emails from your PHP scripts. Now, in order to use the mail function from your scripts, there are several configuration directives that you'll need to set up in PHP.ini, and we're going to walk through that. But before we do that, I'm going to go and give a little bit of overview about how email on the internet works. So SMTP, or as is known, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, is basically the protocol that's used between servers on the internet to exchange email. So when you send an email from one email address to another, SMTP is basically the rules that are used to get that email from where it's originated to where it's going. The protocol is implemented by things known as mail transfer agents, or MTAs, or as they're more commonly known, and you probably heard them referred to as a mail server. And basically, whenever you send an email from an email client like Outlook or via a web-based email like Gmail, your message gets sent along to a mail server, an SMTP server sometimes is referred to, which will relay it or pass the message along to the recipient's SMTP server, or the recipient's, receiving mail server. So now I just want to go over how this sort of works in Windows, because there's a little bit of difference between how the typical an email is sent typically in Windows and in a Linux and Unix operating system. So we kind of have a diagram here, and basically we have a client computer, and this little symbol here is for the Mozilla email client, which is a free, it's Thunderbird. It's free from Mozilla, and it's an email client used to send and receive emails. Basically what happens is when you're in Thunderbird on your computer, your Thunderbird application, when you go to send an email, it actually contacts a mail server, typically on your local network, and it sends a message to it via SMTP. And what happens is once the mail server receives that message, it reads it and figures out where it needs to go, and actually sends it through the internet over to whoever the recipient is, whatever domain they reside on. It's going to send it to their mail server, and it's going to use SMTP to do that. And then what happens is then when the client on the other side, the recipient, opens up their Thunderbird, so they're using Thunderbird as well to download their email, typically what happens is they'll download their email from the mail server using what you might have heard as the POP or IMAP protocols. We're not really going to be talking about that too much in this lesson. We're going to be concerned with the sending of emails, so we're going to talk about sort of the SMTP structure. So in Windows, this is typically how it works. You have an email being sent from your client, and basically it gets sent to a mail server, which actually sends it out over the internet. And the mail server is typically on your local network. Now the typical setup in a Linux or Unix environment is a little bit different. In this case, we have as our client PHP, and an email client typically refers to something that sends or receives email, and because we're going to be sending email from PHP, we can consider PHP a client. Now if you notice, there's no mail server over here like there was in the setup. Basically on a typical Linux setup, there's actually a program called SendMail, which you may have heard of before, which actually is its own mail it's actually a mail server. So typically wherever you have PHP running, it has SendMail running on the same computer. So instead of forwarding a message via SMTP out to a local mail server, we'll then forward it along to the client like this. What actually happens is PHP or your mail client, it could be Thunderbird as well, will send the message along to the local SendMail program running. And then what SendMail does is that's the actual mail server, and it actually is the one that goes out through the internet and via SMTP sends it along to the client's mail server. And then same as before, the client, the recipient can download it via POP or IMAP to read the email. So the main difference here is that typically on Linux, you actually have your mail server or your SMTP server running on the same computer as your email client. Now, as mentioned, PHP.ini provides a number of configuration directives that allow you to configure how the mail function is going to work. And it depends, the way you set the configuration directives depends on whether you're going to be in a Windows environment or a Linux or Unix environment. Typically, when you're using a Windows environment, you're going to be setting a directive called SMTP, and basically what that does is that allows you to specify the name of your email server, your local email server that you're going to use to send out your messages. In our diagram, that was where that first server where the client passed the email along to be sent out over the internet. In Linux environment, you're going to be using typically the directive sendmail path. And what that does is that actually is it gets set to the location of where the SendMail program is on your local machine. Because as we said, SendMail runs on the same machine as your email client or PHP. With the SendMail path, we actually specify the file location of that SendMail program or SendMail binary. And that way PHP knows how to invoke the SendMail program to get it to send the email out over the internet. And if we actually go and take a look at, if we open up php.ini, and quite a ways down the page, in the section where extensions are configured, there's a section called mail function. You can see a couple directives here. Here's the SMTP directive that we talked about, and this is, as mentioned, it says for Win32 only. This is typically what's used in the Windows environment. And basically what you would do is set it to your local SMTP server. And that's going to depend on what you use for your email. For a lot of people, if you have, for example, cable internet or DSL, your cable internet provider or ISP actually gives you the name of a server you can use as an SMTP server, which allows you to send email. So, for example, sometimes, for example, Roadrunner it's like a Time Warner cable cable internet service. Often their SMTP server that they give to you is called something like SMTP server.roadrunner.com. And so what that does is, and so basically what this directive is saying is that's telling PHP that when it sends an email using the mail function, that it's supposed to send the email to this SMTP server on your local network, and then to have that SMTP server actually send it out over the internet. Let me reset this back to its default value. Now the other directive we talked about was the sendmail path, and this is, as you can see, it says for Unix and Linux. And basically what that is, if you look further down, it's basically a path to the sendmail binary, which is a sendmail program that runs on your computer. Now this is actually a Windows path because we're running a Windows server. And we're going to talk in a little bit about a SendMail program that's provided by XAMPP, so that you can sort of mimic kind of the SendMail program in Linux. But typically, this is going to be set to a Unix path, and it's going to be set to wherever your SendMail binary is located at. Let me just go ahead and comment this back out, save. So one of the things that often happens is your mail server, your outgoing mail server, your SMTP server, it often requires authentication. And that's because if it didn't require authentication, it's considered like an open relay, they call it. Spammers would take advantage of it and just send the email requests to it, and it would they could use that server to send out email as much as they wanted, to different places. So typically, your SMTP server, like the one provided by your local cable provider, is going to require some sort of authentication, so it knows that you're allowed to send emails from that server. It can be done in a couple of different ways. One common thing is to use a username and password that your ISP provider will give you. Another thing that can be used in combination with the username and password, or actually on its own, is your ISP will require that any email sent using their SMTP server, using their local outgoing mail server, be originated from a computer that's on the same local network as the mail server. So so for example, if you have a cable internet service, you have to actually be logged onto your computer at home that's accessing the internet through your cable modem in order to use, for example, your local SMTP server. If you try to access it elsewhere, it may not authenticate you. So in a Windows environment, we can use the SMTP directive, and the Windows environment is what we're developing in this course. And if that doesn't work because of authentication is required, a username and password is required, there's actually a program that I mentioned called It's actually called Fake SendMail for Windows that's provided with XAMPP, and basically what it does is it gives you a few more options for being able to connect to your local SMTP server, basically allowing you to provide authentication. So as mentioned, the program is called Fake SendMail for Windows, and it's located in there's a directory in your XAMPP installation called SendMail. And that contains the SendMail. It's called SendMail.exe, which is this program here. And basically, sort of the feature that it adds onto the base functionality that PHP provides through PHP INI, which just lets you provide a basic SMTP server through the SMTP directive, and doesn't allow for any authentication. Basically, Fake SendMail sort of has an add-on feature that allows you to be able to specify a username and password to your SMTP server, so that for those of you whose ISPs require you to do authentication before sending an email, it's going to give you the ability to do that. The username and password that you provide to your SMTP server actually gets configured in a file called sendmail.ini, which is in the SendMail directory of the XAMPP installation. And basically that configuration file is how you specify to this Fake SendMail program how you're supposed to connect to your SMTP server. And basically what that does is you specify the name of the server, for example, smtp.roadrunner.com or .net, and then you provide your username and password your ISP provider has given you in order to authenticate yourself to that server. So actually, let's sort of take a look at how this Fake SendMail program kind of changes things when working with XAMPP for Windows. As you can see in this diagram, we have our mail server back, and then we also have Fake SendMail in the diagram as well. And so what the way using the Fake SendMail program works is kind of a hybrid approach to sending email in a Windows environment. Basically, you have your email client, in this case PHP, and instead of sending an email directly to the mail server via like the SMTP configuration directive in PHP INI, it actually sends it to a Fake SendMail program, and it's configured using the SendMail path. So even though we're not using a Unix computer, we actually configure the send mail path directive. And as we saw in the php.ini file, XAMPP actually goes ahead and when you configured XAMPP, it set the send mail path directive for you to point to this fake send mail program. And what you do is you turn that directive on, and so when PHP goes to send a message, it actually sends the message to the fake send mail, to the fake send mail. And then what SendMail does, instead of actually being its own, it's not an actual SMTP server. It's not an outgoing mail server like the real SendMail is. What it actually does is it goes ahead and it still uses the local outgoing mail server on your network. But what it does is it allows you to configure it so that it can provide a username and password so it can authenticate. So it sends it out to your mail server via SMTP using authentication. And then everything sort of goes as normal from there. Your local mail server sends it by SMTP through the internet over to your recipient client on the other side. So if we actually go and take a look at the sendmail.ini file, which is the fake sendmail configuration file, we can see it has a number of sort of directives in it. It's formatted very similar to php.ini. The main directive you're going to use is SMTP server, which basically corresponds to the SMTP directive in php.ini, and that's going to be the name of your ISP's outgoing mail server. So again, it could be like smtp.roadrunner.com. And then it has a couple of other configuration directives that you can do. You can actually set, and this is going to be helpful, and we're going to use this when we show how this is actually show an example of actually sending an email. You can enable error logs and debug logs, and they provide you information if you're having trouble configuring the sendmail.exe, the fake sendmail, to work. So that's going to be useful to you if you're having problems. Then down here, this is sort of the key difference, is there's an auth username and auth password directive, which basically is going to allow you to enter whatever your username and password your ISP provided to you to use to authenticate yourself to the SMTP server. So example, the username is typically like your email address. You might say, my email address is user@roadrunner.com and my password is, it wouldn't be something like this, but excuse me, it'd be password. And so that's going to configure SendMail so that when PHP goes ahead and it sends and it tries to send an email, it's going to run this fake SendMail program, which is going to read this sendmail.ini configuration file. It's going to be able to gather your username and password to authenticate itself to your local SMTP server specified up here, and then send the email that way. So let me just go ahead and put these back. So now let's actually talk about the mail function, which is the function built into PHP that allows you to send email. And it's what gets configured through PHP.ini, as we had talked about. Basically, it has 3 required arguments. You have to have a to email address, you have to provide a subject, and you have to provide a message. It also has 2 optional arguments. And it also returns a Boolean value indicating whether the email was successfully passed on to the mail server for delivery. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, because just because the mail function returns true, indicating that it was delivered to your email message was delivered to the mail server, it doesn't necessarily mean the email is going to be properly delivered. There may be problems on the mail server, such as if you have an incorrect email address or something like that. So you have to kind of be careful with that. We're going to talk about some cases, different cases where the mail function will return true even though your email doesn't actually get sent. Now, the one important thing to note is that the first optional argument, which if you look at the PHP documentation for mail, the mail function is called additional headers. and it's an optional argument, but it's typically almost always required. And basically what the argument is a string where you can pass email headers like from, carbon copy, blind carbon copy, and so forth. Now, in order to send an email, you actually have to have a from email address specified. So even though this is and there's no from argument in mail, so what you actually have to do is specify a from header, create a string that contains a from header that says the word, that has the form basically right here. It has from with a colon and then the email address you're sending it from. You have to create that as a string and add that as the fourth argument to the mail function. So an example of using the mail function, you have your to email address as the first argument. You have some sample subject text. You have the content of your email message, and then this optional but pretty much required parameter is the additional headers parameter, and that says, and here we provided the header from, and we provided a from email address. So let's actually go and take a look at one of our scripts that we've created to show this. First of all, let's look at mail.php, which is is a script we've created to demonstrate just the basic mail functionality. What we've done is we've hard-coded a couple of different values. We've hard-coded a to email address, a subject, and a test message. We've also created a variable called email headers, which holds this required from header that has the from email address. And then we make a call to the mail function, including the to email address, the subject, the message, and then this email header. And then what happens is we output a message saying whether the email was sent successfully or there was an error. And what happens is when we run the mail function, as mentioned, it returns a Boolean value that gets stored in the variable sent, and so we can test sent down here. If it's true, the email was sent successfully. If not, there was an error. But as mentioned before, it doesn't necessarily mean that email is actually going to be delivered. It just means it was successfully passed along to the mail server. So if we actually go and try to run this page, it's going to go ahead, everything's hard-coded, it's just going to go ahead and try and send out an email. And if we go ahead and load the page, you can see we get an error, and it's saying failed to connect to mail server at localhost. Verify your SMTP and SMTP port configuration directives in PHP INI are set properly, and we also get our own error message. Basically, that's saying that our mail is not configured properly. So what we're going to do now is actually go ahead and walk through the process of configuring PHP INI and actually sendmail.ini so that we can send emails from our PHP scripts. Now, we're going to be using the fake sendmail program because the mail server that we use at educator.com requires SMTP authentication, and so using sendmail is going to allow us to provide a username and password to authenticate ourselves. So if we go to php.ini, we're actually going to comment out the SMTP directive because we're not going to be having PHP actually try and connect to the local SMTP server. We're going to have it use the fake sendmail program. So we uncomment this sendmail path directive, which when you set up XAMPP is automatically configured to point to the fake sendmail program. And then if we go into our sendmail.ini folder, we're going to enter the SMTP server we use at educator.com, which is called mail.educator.com. We're going to go ahead and turn on the error log file and the debug log file because this will be useful to us in a bit. And then we're going to go ahead and enter our SMTP username and password that we need for authentication. Now the username we use is test@educator.com. That's our email address. And then our password, I'm actually just going to do it off the screen here, is what we need to authenticate with. Now because we've changed the because we've changed our php.ini file, we need to restart Apache as we always do anytime we make changes. So I'm going to stop it and restart it. And if we go and reload the page. We should see that our email was sent successfully. So basically what happened is this time when we ran it, when we called the mail function, PHP looked at the php.ini configuration file. It saw that we're using a send mail binary to send our email to the local SMTP server, and then it went ahead and invoked that. It read the sendmail.ini configuration file to get our username and password to be able to send it to the server. So actually, if we go and look, I have a local instance of Mozilla, the Mozilla email client running, and we can see that we just received the email from our web page, and it says mail function test. Let me just turn the headers off. And so it confirms that our email function has worked. So one thing to actually note is if we go back to our mail page, is that typically you actually prepend the mail function with the error control operator, because if an error gets generated, you get this sort of ugly warning message as we had seen earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and do that here, and then we're going to create an error message that's going to get this PHP error message variable that we had talked about when we learned about the error control operator. And then so if we have an error, it's going to output it down here. And so just to sort of show how that works, I'm actually going to go back to, let's see, our php.ini file, and just temporarily get rid of the send mail. Just make, well, we use localhost.com, make up some SMTP server that shouldn't work. If we restart our XAMPP or Apache and we reload the page, it's taking a little while. And that's probably because we've actually messed up the configuration. You can actually see that we've gone ahead and saw there was an error sending the email. But we didn't get that ugly warning message because we used the error suppression operator. So if we go back, look at mail.php, we can see how that worked. So one other page that we've example page that we've created is called emailform.php, and basically what this is it's sort of an expansion on what we had just learned, and it's basically a way to sort of instead of hard coding an email into our system, it's going to allow us to specify an email address, a subject, and a message, and actually send the email out. And before I do that, let me go ahead and correct the configuration again on php.ini. And restart the mail server. And I'm actually going to go ahead and run that mail.php page again to confirm that our functionality is the email functionality is working again. Email was sent successfully, and actually if I go and look at my inbox, I can see that it was set. So the email is back working again. So basically the way the email form works is you enter a return address email or a from email. And this is something a customer could do on your website. Just going to create a test subject, test email, comment. And if we click send email, it's going to be using the same process, except it's going to be using the data we provided here to go ahead and send the email. And if I go and look at my inbox, we can see an email created. It has test subject as the subject, which is what I provided, and it has from test@educator.com, which is what I provided in the form, and then also the comments that I provided in the message part of the form. So if we go and look at emailform.php, when we take a look at it, it actually takes two get variables. It has an action variable, and then it also has a contact info variable. And what happens is when you go to that page originally, no action variable is provided, and so what it does is it loads the form that we saw. And basically the form has 3 different fields in it that all populate a contact info associative array. Here they populate with the keys from, subject, and message. And then when we submit the form, we actually go ahead and submit it with the hidden field called action that says send email. And the form, if you notice, it submits to itself email form.php. So when the form reloads, it's going to come down here and test to see what HTML output. It's going to say if action is null or if action is not equal to send mail, output the form. Well, because the action is going to be set to email now, to send email now, it's going to go down here and it's actually going to process the information that we submitted and send out the email. As you can see, we've hard-coded the to email address because we want to send it to the admin, for example, on this website, which is just going to be our test@educator.com email address we have set up. And then it pulls the from, subject, and email message from the contact info variable that was provided by a get. We go ahead and we add the from header, which is necessary to send the email, and then go ahead and run the mail function. And we use the error suppression operator so we don't get an ugly warning message, and then we output an error message if an error occurred, and if not, we output that the email was done successfully. And as we saw when we submitted the form, it's currently working, and so everything works as expected. So now we're going to talk about updating the web application. Now that we've learned about how to configure email to work in our PHP setup, and we've learned about how to use the mail function, we're going to add what we're going to call a Contact Us page to our web store application. Basically what that's going to do is that's going to allow a customer to go ahead and basically send some comments to the store administrator via email, saying maybe they like this or that about the store. And it's an example of a way you can have, if you were to have your own website, you could have people submit information to you or comments to you. It's going to make use of the mail function, and we're actually going to make use of some email-related constants that we're going to add to config.php. So we're going to be creating contactus.php. We're going to be editing the config file because we're going to be adding some constants, which we'll see in a minute. We're also going to edit the footer, and that's because we're going to add a link to the Contact Us page at the bottom of all of our pages. And then we're not going to talk about it, but there's actually some modifications that are going to occur to store.css that basically format the Contact Us form. So real quickly to talk about the new page contactus.php, similar to the example we had just gone over, it's going to take 2 get input parameters. One's going to be called action, and one's going to be called contact info. And action, as before, is going to determine whether the page is just going to show the form to the user that allows them to enter their comments, or whether it's actually going to process the comments that they submitted via get and actually send out the email. What we're going to do is that we're going to use the value contact us. We're going to set the value action equal to contact us when we actually want it to process the email. So when we process the form, when we have a user submit the form, we're actually going to submit a hidden input field as well that's called action, and it's going to be set to the value contact us, so that when the page reloads, it's going to know that it's supposed to, instead of outputting the form, it's supposed to go ahead and try and send the email. Contact info is an associative array that basically contains the information the customer submits on the Contact Us form. It's going to contain their name, their email address, and whatever comments they submitted. And we're also going to have it so that the form validates contact info just to make sure that all 3 of these fields, we're going to require that all 3 of these fields be provided. And just so you know, the default action for the page is just to display the Contact Us form. And so that's if no action is specified to the form, or you specify an action that isn't the value Contact Us, the default action is to always just go ahead and display the Contact Us form. So let's go take a look at what the form looks like. If we look at web application, this is new version 9.0. We can look at, well, first let's go to store.php, and we can actually see there's been a link added to the bottom of all the pages because we basically just added a link to footer.html. And if we actually go take a quick look at that, You can see we just added one more link to the bottom here. And when we click on that Contact Us link, it's going to take us to Contact Us PHP. And this is what the form looks like. It has a place where we can enter, a customer can enter their name, their email address, and their comments. And so go ahead and enter my name, my email address, and then some comments about the store. And clicking the Contact Us button, it's going to go ahead and send an email to basically we have a pre-configured to a pre-configured address which we have set up in config.php. So the email was sent successfully. It says thank you for your comments. Actually, since I have my email client running, we can go and look at it, and because the pre-configured email that it gets sent to is our test@educator.com email. We can see that it sent an email and it said Matthew McCaj had some comments for the store, and then it output my comments that I had submitted on the form. So let's go and take a look at the code that does this. First of all, let's take a look at config.php. And in config.php, we've gone ahead and added two constants. We've added one called admin email2. And basically what that is anytime a user submits comments on the Contact Us form, it's going to get sent to this email address. Because we always want it sent to the same spot, we set it up as a constant, and in this case we're calling it admin email2. Additionally, we always want our administrator, when they look up their comments received from the store in their email client, we want to have the same subject line so that they can identify where they're coming from. And so we've created a constant for that called Contact Us email subject, and basically it just says educator store comments, which basically lets the administrator know that somebody submitted comments from the educator store. Now the Contact Us.php page basically at the top it processes the two get variables that it can use. One is action and one is contact info, as we had talked about. And then in the data processing section, if the action is set to Contact Us, which means the user submitted the form, it goes ahead and just checks to make sure that all of the fields on the form were not empty. And if so, it goes ahead and will output the appropriate page title. If not, it's going to output an error message saying you must complete all fields to use this form. So for example, if we go back and we leave out the comments, going to give you the error message saying you need to complete all the fields on the form. This is error processing, as we had seen before. And then in the output section, we output a common title, so the page is always going to say Contact Us. If no error has occurred and the action has not been specified or it's not equal to Contact Us, then we're saying, okay, go ahead and output the Contact Us email form. And basically the Contact Us form submits its get data to itself. It uses the contact info associative array, and then it also defines as a hidden get variable, defines action with Contact Us. So when the form is submitted, you'll be able to, it will know how to process the Contact Us information. It will also know that it's not supposed to output the form, but in this part down here, it's actually going to say if the action equals Contact Us, it's going to go ahead and send the email. And in this case, we can see we've created some short variables for the customer's name, the email, the comments they submitted, which basically loads information from the Contact Us get variable. Basically, what it does is we then go ahead and build up an email message, which you saw in the email program we had. And what it does is set it up so that it outputs the person's name. It said so-and-so had some comments on the store. And then we add to that this email message the comments that were provided, and sort of by default it's going to send email in plain text. So here we're actually using new lines as opposed to breaks to format the email how we want. We create the email header, and in this case instead of having it hard-coded, we use the email address provided by the customer and set the header that way. And then here we go ahead and we call the mail function. And as you can see, we've used the two constants we created in config.php. For the to address, we've set it to the admin email2 constant, so it's always going to send it to our administrator email account. It's always going to have the subject specified by contact us email subject constant. Here we've included the message that we built up here, which has the customer's name and their comments. And then we've also added the email headers variable, which has the from header for the email message. Down here, basically, if this is successful, and here we use the error suppression operator again. If it's successful, it outputs a thank you message. If not, it says there was an error in sending your comments. And so that's how the Contact Us page works. One thing you might note is that, and this is sort of kind of unrelated, but it's a commenting thing, is sometimes you'll see that at the end of if statements, for example, we have if action equals null or action is not equal to contact us. When you're getting ready to enter another else if statement, you can add a comment to the end on the same line as the curly brace of the if statement, basically saying the test condition that was used to enter that. So that basically down here we know that, okay, this section up here was entered if action was equal to null or if action was equal to not equal to contact us. Similarly, at the bottom of this else if statement, we can at the end of the curly brace, we can add a comment saying, okay, this section was entered from action equals contact us. And that's just a way to kind of provide some feedback to you as far as comments go within your script to make it a little bit easier to read, because when you have long else if and if statements like this, you might not know exactly what the test condition was that had you enter that. And so this kind of just adds a little more information to that. So now I just want to quickly talk about the homework challenge we're going to have for this course. Basically, I'd like you to go ahead and try and set up your XAMPP configuration so that you can send email from your PHP scripts. And you may just be able to edit the php.ini file, just edit that SMTP directive. Maybe your local SMTP server doesn't require authentication, or it does require authentication, but it doesn't require username and password. It just requires that you send the email from a computer on your network. So I would suggest going ahead and trying just setting that first. And you'll need to contact your ISP to find out what the domain name of your SMTP or outgoing mail server is. Alternatively, you may have to use the fake send mail program if your outgoing or SMTP mail server requires authentication. And what you can do there is, as we had gone over, you can edit sendmail.ini in order to add your username and password so that you can perform authentication. You also are going to need to change in PHP-ini, not to forget, you need to enable the sendmail path directive, which is going to tell PHP to use the fake sendmail program. Once you've done that, just go ahead and set up a sample script that is going to call the mail function with some hard-coded values, making sure to include the from header as that fourth argument to the mail function. And just do that in order to test the configuration. So go ahead and try sending an email, and then make sure that you can see it in your email client that it's actually being sent, and just to verify the configuration. Once you've done that, just create a script similar to what we did in the course today that contains a form where a user can put their email address, a subject, and a message, and using an action get parameter, have the script basically submit the form to itself, and based on the action that says something like contact us or send email, have the email be generated using the information that the user provided in the form, and have it send out the email. Be sure to test to verify that the mail function worked and was successful, and then also check in your email client to make sure that the email was delivered. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.